Yeah. All right. So my talk is called If This, Then That, and it's basically about writing for games with Jon Keevy, who is surprisingly a professional. That joke probably went over the first time a little bit better, but I hope that you all just chuckle to yourselves anyway. So this is a thing focused kind of on my experiences writing for games. It touches on a little bit of how to and my background and everything. And hopefully there are interesting things, but I really just expect you to ask me any questions that you have. And feel free to interject and interrupt. The slides on the screen are kind of the departure points for the subjects that I'm talking about. Okay, cool. So if this, then that. Part one, the status quo. Okay, so obviously before you can turn, you have to be going somewhere. Otherwise, you're static. You've got to start somewhere. For me, I was writing theater and doing improv. Theater teaches great formal skills. It teaches you about structure and beats and systems and how to get into characters' heads. Whereas improv teaches collaboration and flexibility, like really, really wonderful skills. The kinds of skills that you have are the things that like make you valuable. But I don't just mean the skills that show up on your CV. I mean like things that you picked up throughout your life doing all kinds of different things. Because story is not just about your ability to work with a particular medium, whether that medium is the programming language of Twine or Yarn or just the written word. Your ability to write story is your ability to experience the world, to reflect on it, and to have an interesting set of perspectives on the world. You know, whatever has like taken you to where you are. That is kind of the basis of what makes good stories. The chapters here are all just from story structure, by the way. Part one, the status quo. Your skills that match the job title are the things that get you hired, but it's your background and interests that make you an individual, and that's what makes you valuable. I didn't come into working with games with a desire to. I didn't come into game making with an ambition to. Basically, when Free Lives hired me to write Gentle Jousting, they asked themselves, who do they know who can write dick jokes? And maybe also sneak in some philosophy. And, well, that was me. I had just put on a play called Dirty Words, which was all about raunchy humor. And the Free Lives team, the bunch of them, had made a game jam game that involved floppy penises. And they thought, you know what? It would be hilarious if this very, very silly game had a whole philosophical bent to it. Maybe not a literal bent, but you know what I mean. This ability to sneak in this whole joke turned into a massive amount of development in the game because they thought it would just be funny to have, you know, dicks and philosophy and ideas. So even though if I knew nothing about the game, about making games, they also knew nothing about making narrative games. So it was a very big, steep learning curve for all of us making this big game. And we didn't realize how huge a task we were undertaking at the beginning of it. Whether it was from Evan Greenwood and Richard Peterson, and Robbie coming in and just figuring out what was going on, how to have triggers, how to keep variables, and how to tell an interesting story. The idea that we could teach like different philosophers like Schopenhauer and stuff quickly fell by the wayside as we began to like get deeper into like what the meat of the story is. I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. Part three, choices and conflict. You see, the traditional elements of story are these five things: plot, character, theme, setting, and conflict. That's a traditional like breakdown in any novel or movie or anything. Game writing is particularly interesting because it has this sixth element. It is choice. Um, Only games have that ability. And as soon as you inject choice into another medium, whether it's a choose your own adventure novel or the Bandersnatch on Netflix, it becomes a game. That's just how we define games. Our ability to interact with them is like the most crucial part. Yeah. So it all boils down to like this idea of choice. That's what we are creating when we're creating game narratives. Yeah, this is probably like I'm definitely stepping over some very like basic stuff here. A linear progression in most stories are plot beat, plot beat, plot beat, plot beat. Yeah. One single line. We often call this a railroad. When an interactive story isn't that interesting, or maybe not that interesting, when the focus is, let me rather say, rather than saying not that interesting, let me rather say that the focus is on other parts of the game, mechanic, or the puzzle, or whatever it is, and not the story. So plot beat, plot beat, plot beat, linear progression. Then you have the idea of branching progression. This is basically the multiplier. Each plot beat might lead to a choice, which will lead to different plot beats, which will further divide into different choices, offering plot beats. This can like just become a huge pyramid. It can also spiral outwards. It can take like a lot on different shapes. What most games tend to do is have a little bit of this and a little bit of linear into a braided progression using plot beats, choices, plot beats that bring back into like the central plot, into the main plot line, which might divide again by choices to give players not an illusion of choice, but a palette of choices that weaves a pathway through the story. And that pathway through the story may well be unique to them depending on how complicated this braid is. However, it is manageable within the scope of us as game creators. As a narrative designer, your goal is to create the feeling for the player that their choices matter, and that's really it. You also want to create a little bit of like wonder and curiosity, obviously, but really that's the essential thing. Do the choices of the players matter? Do they change the story? Are they important? What is a meaningful choice? So there are kind of three important factors to a meaningful choice. Like number one, they're consciously made. They have context and they have consequences, right? Consciously made, has context, has consequences. So that means that a narrative has to give the player agency in the story. The player has to like want things and make choices to do things. It also must provide information, the lore of the world, the facts surrounding it, who the people are, who the character is, how the world works. And finally, they have to remember what has gone before. A narrative with amnesia is a narrative with a bit of a problem. But this is where we really collide into the mechanics of the game, because the narrative mechanic is that memory. And essentially, it boils down to if this, then that. That is what it means to have a consequence. If I do this, then this will probably happen. Everything that we're considering in the world, if this, then that. Part 4. Rising complications. Okay, so memory being the core of meaningful choices, like there are an infinite possible number of variables that a game could track. But because they're combinatorial, a small number can create unique experiences. So one of the common errors, and definitely an error that we did early in this game, is to think, hey, we need to track a we need to track as many variables as there are choices. And this quickly like spirals into a very big problem with tracking and how you're managing the variables that you're tracking. I'm not going to get into kind of like the specifics of that. That really depends on whether you're working with Twine or Yarn or a system of your own or an Excel spreadsheet, which is what we started off in Gentle Jousting working with. Yeah. So thinking of variables rather as combinatorial, then a small number can create unique experiences. So you're trying to create not a unique branch, a unique path along a spreading, wide, branching narrative, but rather a unique path through the braided narrative with small, unique choices being tracked. What this might look like in a slice is here is a small interaction. We've tracked a couple of things. We've tracked an attitude, which that might just simply be a 1 to 5 burial grade, or it might just be a binary one, positive or negative, or neutral. You can fine grain that as much as you want, and combine that with remembering a couple of past actions to give unique interactions. In this little one, where a NPC is giving you a mission. Hey, loser buddy, depending on what the variable is. I like the hat you stole, reference to a past action. I need you to do something for me. All this is just to let the player know that we are paying attention to what you're doing. It might be a small selection of things, but small things can go a very, very long way. Lately, Hades has been getting a lot of deserved praise because it always lets you know that it's been paying attention to what you have been doing, which isn't a set of major paths to the braids. It's just keeping track of a small number of variables that pay off later. It also might look a little bit like this, where the order of the actions is what is important. You might have a location as a trigger. So, for instance, in Gentle Jousting, you have the character, the player, smashing a room full of things, and each of those things triggers a dialogue. He smashed the box, the plate, the painting, the computer. Oh no, not the couch, John. And that unique order creates a unique experience for the player. But this is where we kind of got into the weeds in Gentle Jousting. We put so much effort into creating a unique order of he smashed the box, he played the plate and the painting, that I don't know that it really like paid off. Was it, do you need to say it in the box, the plate, the painting, the computer? And if it was in a different order, would that matter to the player? I like to think that despite the effort and the large amount of resources that it took, that it was worth it for the player to go like, oh, hey, it's paying attention to what I'm pushing off the edge of the world. Huh, interesting. So yeah, that's that combinational, the order of things making a difference and making an experience unique. Part 5, the cave. So in the structure of like every story, there gets to what's known as the cave. This is like the part where the character is tested the most deeply. This is showing the character like what the failure might look like. And it has to do with what you, the game maker, are saying about the world and the feeling you're trying to create for those players and why you're trying to do this. So how does this necessarily work? How do you figure out what the most important choice is and what you're saying about the world? Well, you've got to write it out in a pretty singular statement. The thesis of the game should be written out something like, if this, then that. If the world is this way, then this is true. If good people quit, then evil triumphs. And the antithesis of that statement, if not this, then that. All right. So this is a nice exercise. You can like look at various games and stuff and say, what are they saying about the world, and various pieces of fiction as well. They relate to what are the central forces of conflict. What is rising up against your player, standing in their way of getting to their ultimate goals? What is the consequences of them failing to get to their goal? One of my most significant moments emotionally playing a game was playing this War of Mine. This War of Mine is a beautiful, tragic survival game set in a war very similar to the Bosnian Civil War. People trapped in Sarajevo trying to get by. You have to craft medical supplies. You've got to trade. You've got to go out at night scrambling, and your characters that you are managing in this abandoned house are gradually getting into despair. And the most beautiful moment happened that I was unaware that this game was even possible having, was when one of my characters broke down completely and lost all hope. And my other character, one of the other characters in the house, suddenly got the option to comfort them. They'd been able to heal them, patch them up, talk to them, and various others. But this was the first time this comfort them came up. And these two characters kind of knelt on the floor of this abandoned building, snow piled up outside the door. And it was just like a really beautiful, hopeful thing, about a hopeful statement. If we can work together, then we can survive. Now, that game, because you have a choice, because the whole game is made out of choices, it needs the antithesis. And the antithesis in this War of Mine is, if we prey upon each other, then no one will survive. And it's a very dark and tragic game. It's a very complicated game. Yeah, and because it's a survival game, it's particularly tragic. Yeah. Sorry, I'm already just thinking about it and going like, oh man, that was an intense game.
Yeah, it was a very difficult game to play.
Very difficult game to play. In a similar vein, Bastion presents a fascinating choice to the audience. Bastion from Supergiant, which has its theme of after the apocalypse and trying to kind of rebuild the world. And it has a defiance of its own. It offers a defiance of its own mechanic. You can act out to forgive someone and bring peace to the world. You don't know that it's going to bring peace. You can only all that you know about the choice is that it will make you vulnerable, and it will be a personal forgiveness of something, of some other character, an NPC who's betrayed you. And it's basically the statement of, if we can forgive each other, we can transcend our differences. And if we cannot, then we will continue with war. It's very interesting to consider in the in kind of the shadow of ludonarrative dissonance, and how people are sometimes able to overcome that. So the whole team needs to know the thesis, and it should stem from the verbs of the game mechanics itself. So in my circle of people, of writers and creators, I often get people asking me, like, approaching me and saying, I've got a great idea for a game. How do I get someone to make the game? And this is always the wrong approach if you want to make a game. The game should come from the verbs of the game and the mechanics itself, because the thesis needs to be led from that. And this is where ludonarrative dissonance can also like come in and play havoc with your game. Because if you want to say something about the world, about your world, your philosophy and your outlook on life that is contrary to the game, then you're going to be in trouble. It's difficult to do like a 4X explore, expand, exterminate game if you believe in pacifism and growing pacifism and growth and collaboration. And I think there is something that in Free Lives that we went from developing a game about conquering an alien landscape to then they moved on to making a game about rehabilitating a landscape and what the values that they wanted to really like talk about in there. So yeah, it leads the choice of genre as well. This War of Mine could only have been a survival game because that is the kind of thing that they wanted to talk about in the world. So the art, the music, everything comes down to this. What is the thesis of the game, which should be perfectly reflected in the verbs of the mechanics. So if you have an interesting mechanic that you want to look at, try and figure out what that says about the world, how you can use these verbs in your if this then that statement. If I can shoot all the enemies, then I can make the world a better place. I don't know, Duke Nukem. Okay, so what exactly is the cave? So it's the most important choice. It's the choice that tests the thesis itself. It's the choice that reflects who the player has made the character into and recontextualize all that has gone before, right? If I can, I've covered a little bit of this already. But yeah, so while everything else can create a unique experience, can with like a little bit of variables and a little bit of tweaking, you always, if you want to do a game that really tells a story, you need to have an important choice, a real test. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with having just a game that has a bit of a story and it's interesting, and it leads characters on a railroad. But if you really want to have a true narrative game, I feel like you need the most important choice. Often this is the choice that that challenges how the characters see the world and what the goals of the player character are. There is an inherent tension between what we think we want and what we actually need. This was what the story of Gentle Jousting was all about. It was about the tension between what we think we want and what we really need. Exploring ideas around toxic masculinity and the classic, oh, he just needs to get a romantic interest to validate his life, and if he takes these steps, he will get it. To finally recontextualizing that choice to what does the lead character actually need, and they need to have real friendship and vulnerability in order to grow. Yeah, so did we offer a convincing choice to the player? I'm not entirely sure that we offered that choice fully, and that game could have been all that it could have, that game was all that it could have been. But it is like the revelation that that character entered the cave, the lowest point, and faced a dilemma, a true dilemma that recontextualized everything that had gone before. A deep challenge, a dark night of the soul, if you will. Okay. So part 6, the final battle. So the climax of the story, it's the payoff for all that has gone before, and it's injected with fresh urgency and meaning. The final battle for a storyteller is fun to write. It's in the superhero Film, it's the one where the Spider-Man gets up and kicks ass. It's the part where all the Avengers like leap through the portals and fight off Thanos. It's the hurrah moment. It's the moment that like validates the choice by saying like, see how much fun we can have, see how cool this is. In some ways, I'm not as fascinated by this part as I am by the deep choice, which I think you can probably see by how I'm talking about it. Yeah, the payoff never as good as that real hard moment of choice. So, part 7, return and restoration. If the player's choice matters, then they matter. Then what they did matters in the game. I think that is probably like the strongest emotion that you can deliver to a player. When they see what you have said about the world, when they've taken in your thesis of if this, then that, and they feel validated by that. The story of Genital Jousting got really moving user reviews on Steam of people who just understood where we were coming from with depression, toxic masculinity, and these kind of big emotions and what we were saying about the world. And it was incredibly validating for everyone on the team. Just to know that we delivered an experience where players could connect with a character because they mattered. So that's what it boils down to. If this, then that. And I've got a... you want to find me? You can find me on Instagram, on Twitter and all that as @Jon Keevy, literally everywhere. And you can find me on YouTube with Zania Games and Geekery, where I review board games and all kinds of nonsense, play D&D and such. Zania Games and Geekery. I do have a little post-credit scene here. If this, then that is one of the most useful things for world building. Look around at what you need in your story and ask what that means. What else does that mean? And carry on until you're done. If you need a mountain, what does that say? That there's a desert on the other side? That's just geography. You need an ocean. You need an island. What does it say about culture? What does it say about all kinds of things? Always just look around and say, if this exists, then what else exists? Cool. So that is my talk.
Thank you, Jon.
Yeah, thanks. That was very cool.
Cool. How long did I just go on for? I've kind of lost track.
I think it was just under half an hour.
Cool.
Nice.
Cool.
So, questions or anything?
Yeah, sure. I've got a few maybe. You said you started writing in an Excel spreadsheet. How did that work? And then, like, what tools did you end up using eventually? And what would you recommend?
Okay, I'm going to start with what I recommend now. Right now, I'm working with Jon. I think Jon is really great and useful and flexible. I've worked with Twine a bit, but I found it all. It had a steeper learning curve, but maybe that's also because I have a really great team on the other side of Jon plugging into Unity, whereas on Twine I was working just by myself. How did we work on Excel? Okay, so basically we divided up the scenes into a whole bunch of triggers because it was a fumble call game that really like involved because General Jousting was a fumble call game that involved getting stuck on things, knocking things over. The triggers were largely location based, so they would be triggered by knocking over X or Y, and so that would trigger X dialogue. So one column was the trigger, next column was the dialogue written out. The next one was any variables that were required. So if you had already knocked over that thing, or etc. And then like a link to the file location.
Cool. And then Jon, you're saying it integrates very well with Unity as opposed to like Twine.
I haven't worked with. I am a very untechnical person.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not very untechnical, but I am definitely a layman compared to like all of you. So I need a lot of help integrating things. But yeah, Yarn works well.
And like from the design team side, did they also prefer that you use Yarn, or didn't really matter to them?
No, they all preferred Yarn. They all went with Yarn. They explored a couple of different things, but Yarn was the one that they decided on. Yarn Spinner, I should say.
Oh yeah, no, I'm gonna check it out. I don't really know Yarn that well.
No, it's nice. So basically, like, it keeps the variables like quite light, and it's very low on formatting. It lets most of the formatting happen in Unity.
Cool.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've ever worked with like Inkle.
No, never have. No.
Okay, I found that a bit complicated. Maybe Yarn's a bit easier.
Yeah, I could pick up Yarn, so I think anyone else could. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, maybe got more questions. You said there was a very steep learning curve. What would you say were like the biggest obstacles?
Okay, I am terrible with when it comes to scope creep. I keep on saying, "Hey, what if this could happen? What if this could happen?" I had no idea what the investment in time and energy would be to add a lot of the things I was talking about. But I was also very convincing. And anyway, so the first iteration of General Jousting was a vast sprawl of story that needed to be pretty much like cut back to the starting block from the concept. You know, really just reworked from the beginning with a very tight eye on budget and timelines and projections.
Cool. And you were there from the ground up. You guys kind of came together from the start after the game jam.
After the game jam, yeah. So
Okay, cool.
It does sound as if a writer is someone you should get in, like, as soon as possible.
Yeah, I've like heard when I read articles and stuff that like the biggest studios usually leave it for quite late, and that's always a problem. Then the narrative designer has to like come in and try and fix everything up, and it's
Right.
kind of already too late.
Yeah.
I think there's also this additional role that I've kind of like filled in some places. So, for instance, working on Second Earth with Free Lives, my role in the very early stages was concepting it and like story concept. But I also took on like a researching role. I guess because I have like a general background as I write research grants and I do various other kinds of like academic writing as well. Putting together information and the imagination work that can then like feed the other teams was something that I was also that I also think is very important. It's not necessarily a writer's role, but it is a role that someone should take on, for a person bringing together like and bringing the fuel that can inspire the various different departments, and that the game director can like draw from to build things. And I did some work with the tech trees and stuff in that game. as well, and a lot of research into colonizing space, which was a lot of fun. Also, colonizing Mars is a bad idea, by the way.
Good to know.
Why is that?
Mars has incredibly low gravity. It has such low atmosphere and gets huge amounts of radiation that will be like living underground for ages. It would be just way simpler to like hollow
Fix
out asteroids in like the various asteroid belts and mine from there. There's nothing really that we need on Mars. It's an incredibly hostile environment. Yeah. It's just incredibly hostile, and there's no real great reason to do it.
Hmm.
I have a question regarding the caves. So, is it that often the caves kind of come back to, I guess, moral dilemmas more than anything else? Or what is like a good dilemma that the player has? What's a good example or effective examples?
Okay, so yeah, the cave can often be like the it's often like the point where like our understanding shifts, where there's a big betrayal that happens, where a new antagonist might be revealed, where we won't have to like where we have to like shift tactics as well. So yeah, not necessarily a moral dilemma, but okay, so in different like genres of creativity, including different like genres of games, there are 5 levels of conflict. The inner level is like generally like where the moral level is. This is kind of your inner conflict, and a lot of the time that's the cave. That's the proxy of the cave. In the Matrix, Neo literally like goes down into the subway and stops and realizes that no, he has to believe himself and he has to now face Agent Smith. So he stops running and he fights. Yeah, for Luke, it's for Luke in Star Wars, it's turning off his lightsaber and throwing it aside. So yeah, these choices can reflect all different kind of layers of conflict. It's often like the place where one has to make a sacrifice. One faces a kind of defeat. Yeah, I'm trying to think of like good examples in other games. In Hades, spoilers, it's where he makes it all the way to his mother but dies anyway, and the whole shift of that like multiple runs kind of changes into what he's actually trying to do, what Zagreus is trying to do in that game.
You said there were 5 types of conflict?
Oh, okay. Yeah, the 5 types of conflict. There's inner, which is either you against your own mind, or you against your own values, or you against your own body. So, like fumble core is a little bit of an inner conflict. You're like dealing with like the inability of your player proxy, your avatar, to negotiate its way through the world. Moral dilemmas, things like that. The second level is interpersonal, and the interpersonal level of conflict is between those people who are closest to you, your friends, your allies, etc., etc. The genre that like sits kind of closely at this one is probably like soap opera. Soap opera are your like friends and family, your media people, people who you have emotional investments in. So yeah, I'm trying to think of an example where you end up fighting against your brother, your father, etc. Oh well, sorry, Hades. obviously. Everyone is your family and stuff. Everyone is your family, and you're trying to negotiate your way through them in the world. The third level is social, and the social is people who are brought into conflicts not because of any personal relationship they have, but because of their role in society. So this is your war games where your enemies are soldiers or members of a different organization. They are purely your enemies because of who you are, like watchdogs, police officers, GTA, things like that, games like that. The fourth level up is the environment and the forces of nature. This can also be nature as embodied by a supernatural force. Basically, these are your zombies. These are your wolves in the wilderness. This is like the measure of cold. This is your the heartless wilderness. Animals, things like that. It's also distance barriers. The environment around you. Your inability to get physically to a place or get to safety. Volcanoes exploding, mudslides, things like that. The fifth level is probably the rarest, but it can be one of the weirdest, especially in games. And this is the one that like Stanley Parable sits at. It is like the kind of metaphysical slash meta narrative conflict. So in the Stanley Parable, he is literally being confounded by the narrator and the forces of reality, as the whole thing kind of discusses whether like choice is an illusion or not, which was probably like makes it the quintessential game, because it's a game really just asking the question of, are any of these choices real? Do any of them matter? And is life futile? Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, that's
Cool, thanks.
very cool. The conflict thing. Where did you kind of like learn this stuff? Is there like a good place to look for resources?
Okay, so you can generally find. My favorite book is Story by Robert McKee. Let me. Where was the? Type that out. Anyway, Story by Robert McKee. It's basically a book on screenwriting, and that gives like a lot of like background and such. There are also some pretty good resources. I think I'm gonna have to like have a little look around and then like post a little resource pack. Yeah.
That would be great, dude. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is kind of like just general story conflict levels. Is you just use gaming examples?
Yeah, I'm just using gaming examples, but so I think whenever you're like looking around, whenever you're watching a film, try to analyze where the main like bits of conflict sit and how that shifts things around. Where's the primary level of conflict? Which ones are most important? So, for instance, the survival genre, both in games and in like film and story, the two prime levels of conflict are inner and environment. You know, you're facing your body and your determination and despair, versus cold bears, creatures like that. Yeah.
So most stories will kind of have all 5 levels, but just maybe bigger focuses on certain ones.
Yeah.
Okay.
That is also like, it's a very good tool to look around and say like, what's missing in your story? Do you have and where you can like place additional conflicts.
And I noticed you call it like levels. Do you like start at a certain point and move towards it, or is it just like 5 segments? Say now.
It's more just like levels, because I think of it as being concentric circles. The
Okay.
innermost circle being, you, and then your immediate family, society, etc., moving outwards to,
I see.
to the fifth level, which is like encompassing the world and a step outside of the world.
Ooh.
Yeah.
I suppose I'd expect the different types of conflict, if they're all present in the same story, to sort of reflect the same core conflict, or the core if this then
Hmm.
that. But I suppose in a complicated enough story, there might be a whole bunch of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Really good.
Yeah, you don't want to. You definitely want to have variations and things, and their interrelation. How the environmental conflict makes a person face their inner conflict. For instance, in the film, I can't remember what that space movie is now. Gravity. You have that environment forcing Sandra Bullock's character to deal with, to find a will to live and push forward.
Hmm.
So yeah, they're not discrete levels. There are ways of thinking it, but they are fully enmeshed. Yeah.
Cool.
Are there like, I don't know, communities or something for like, if you write some things and you want to know if it's any good, for like showing it to people and getting feedback?
Yeah, there are communities on Reddit, but there's some like Cape Town writers writing meetups that I can find.
Have you been to any of like those write-ups? I've saw them, but I've never like went to one of them.
No, I haven't actually.
Okay.
I tried to get a writing group going once, but writers are flaky.
Yeah, we've
I
tried
know
that too.
I'm one of them.
Yeah.
I think another thing I was wondering is so like, as far as practicing it, I mean, there's like, just do it, but but also like, are there more or less effective ways to just do it?
So for a long time, I've kind of fallen off the habit. Unfortunately, is that I had just like a table of random elements. This would be like my jam board, where in the morning I would like roll my dice and I get my 3 elements, and then I would just kind of free write for about an hour, just to like kind of like get the creativity. There's a lot of garbage that I created in that space, but also some nice things, and just the habit of consistently writing is very important. Active practice basically means also being able to be critical of yourself, and that requires that you read some how-to books and some style guides and such, so that you can not just take your gut reaction, but also have an informed reaction of like why the thing that you're writing is or is not working. Yeah. I'll definitely include 1 or 2 of those in there. Yeah. Also, listening to how people talk is very important, and having a constructive breakdown of why the things you like made you feel the way that you did. I think it's possible to get too absorbed in how a thing works mechanically, and forget that how it works mechanically is only there to serve how it makes you feel. And figuring out why those bits made you feel the way it did is sometimes more important than figuring out like the clever twist in a story, or like Brandon Sanderson as a fantasy writer. I think he's great, but he also has like a very sense of like, oh, you know mechanically how to work this storyline, rather than like feeling like the kind of like surprise and guts that other stories might have. I don't know. Stories are kind of a very weird thing. If you look at like so many movies, so many pieces of fiction and things made today, so often like the weakest part is the writing, the story, or like the line to line bits. And it's kind of bizarre in a world where we have these genius directors, such great acting talent, cinematographers, music, that writing seems to be so often the thing that isn't working. And I think that speaks to like kind of the thing, to kind of the, we don't really know how, even when we know how writing works, we don't truly know how to then be original in how writing works.
Okay.
Mm.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing like, can you actually be original? Like everyone kind of builds off previous writers, past writers.
Yeah. And then there's a lot of just, I think, probably the whole process of how writing gets made, because everyone kind of does have opinions on it that they sometimes like think that they know how to write, and then it doesn't really work. And you're like, but he's still the producer of the series, so of course he's going to
Shit.
so of course he's going to like make himself the director,
Right.
and the writer. In South Africa, the highest paid screenwriters have not had any actual films produced. I think like the top 3.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and the most prolific, who've had the most films produced, are not incredibly well paid because they are the directors themselves. So
Oh wow, okay.
yeah.
So the highest paying ones, how do they get paid but the films don't get produced?
Options mostly. They just films get optioned, passed around, more money goes that way. Which, doesn't necessarily mean a lot of money, but it means a lot more money than the guy who's like, hey, I'm gonna direct my film, I'm not gonna pay myself.
Okay, so it's
And
option
then
like
gets paid as a producer, yeah.
yeah. So it's option like an early stage before kind of a part of the pitching process eventually, if you would like go into the film stages eventually.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Mm.
Oh yeah, and I had like one question about like yeah, just this is my last one. Like what skill sets you would recommend as a writer, and obviously you started from the start with genital jousting, but say now you were to approach someone that's not that big on narrative, how you would convince them, stuff like that.
If I think world building is a skill that that people can very much like point to and say, look at this. This is like my ability to create something that is interesting and compelling with very little, with a minimum amount of investment, without making it feel like I've created a textbook. That's the thing. Compelling world building is key. And that necessitates just showing that you can do research and meld it to imagination, research and imagination. Yeah, dialogue also important. But probably the most important thing is just like being able to present an interesting idea succinctly. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, John. That was super
No
interesting.
problem.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I learned a lot.
thanks so much.
Going along with, I guess I've been saying this every month, but if you have anything that you want to be learning about in games, let us know like what it is, and I feel like we can find an expert, or as close to an expert as we can get to talk about it.
Yeah, well, now I know how to use Yarn. I'm definitely like, oh shit, I can make way better games than when I tried in Twine.
Cool.
Yeah, so maybe next time I will be pitching a game jam game. Yeah.